Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Smart Human Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with internationally renowned earth scientist, science historian, and author, Dr. Naomi Oreskes. Today, we're going to be talking about science, scientific method, skepticism, consensus, how this plays into our current discussions of science, how AI may positively change our scientific method and philosophy, and how science intersects with politics, and so much more. So stay tuned. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with internationally renowned earth scientist, science historian, and author, Dr. Naomi Oreskes. She is the Henry Charles Lee Professor of the History of Science and affiliated professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard University, and beyond being a prolific writer, 200 plus articles, scholarly and popular books. We are going to get into all of her information that she has produced, but also we're going to talk about her latest book as well, which is called The Big Myth. But let's get started. So Dr. Oreskes, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and my audience of The Smart Human.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So where to begin? I mean, there's just so much going on right now. It's pretty crazy. I thought maybe we'd start with really basic stuff, which is, I don't know, I think it's kind of a building block for the rest. Let's talk about science. Let's talk about what is science by definition, and big topic, big question. But why don't you dip us into this conversation as best you can?
Well, thanks for that question, because science is what I do. I've spent my whole life either being a scientist or studying science. And most of my work in the last 30 years has been studying science, trying to understand what science is, how it operates, why we should trust it, and also what conditions might arise where we might legitimately not trust it. And so the way I like to think about science is that in a way, science is really two different things. And I think this is part of the reason why there's so much confusion, because right from the get-go, from ground zero, there's actually two different things that the word stands for. So when we talk about science, we're often referring to a body of knowledge, a body of information, a body of facts that we are taught in school, that you could look up on the internet, that you could find in an encyclopedia, if anyone still uses encyclopedias. And these facts are supposed to be the truth. They're supposed to be what we know about the real world. But at the same time, the word science the word science also refers to an activity, a process. People do science. And by that we mean they do research, they study, they examine the natural world, they make observations, experiments to try to learn about the natural world. And of course, the second activity feeds into the first, but in some ways these two activities are in tension. Because to the extent that science is an activity, it's a learning process. It's a process of discovery. And that means when we learn new things, we necessarily sometimes discover that the old stuff that we thought was true might actually need to be rethought or reconsidered. And so that creates this tension between the first idea of science as a body of definite facts, and the second idea of science as a process that learns to new facts, new information, and sometimes overthrows the first. And one of the things I've studied in the last 20 years is people who explicitly exploit that distinction, who try to make us distrust science because of the fact, because of this tension that the process of discovery sometimes dislodges the bodies of fact.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. When I was going to school back in the day, I feel like I'm still in school technically, but the idea of the scientific method, you had a hypothesis, then you were going to try to figure out whether or not that hypothesis really was true or not. That, having watched even your TED Talk, which I'm going to be putting into our show notes, I think everyone should watch it. It's really fascinating. And by the way, it's up to 1.7
oh my gosh.
million views, because you said 1.6 in your bio. And I thought, oh my gosh, she doesn't realize how much that's grown recently, maybe.
Wow.
But the idea that we were sort of grew up with this process that was sort of built into our science books and our classes, And where is that going now? I mean, because really, you said the premise even of the scientific method really has questions to it as well. Could you explain that?
Yes. Well, if people remember one thing from our conversation today, what I would want it to be is to throw out that idea of the scientific method. I think this has been a really harmful idea because it's given people the idea that scientists just do one thing. Like you say, they have a hypothesis, they test it. We were all taught that in high school chemistry, but it's just not true. The reality is that science is very diverse. There are many different kinds of scientific methods. And depending upon what the question is, the method you use may have to change. And this is really important in the things that I know you care about, health, nutrition. I mean, some of the ideas of what we've heard this term, the gold standard science, that's been much in the news of late. Well, a lot of people have a certain idea of what that is, but that approach typically can't be used for health and nutrition. And so if you throw out science that isn't gold standard science, you're kind of stuck. And so why
is that? Why is it that it can't be used? Is it because it's personalized to even every human's different, or?
Both. So it's more than one reason. So one reason is exactly that. So every person's different. And so, the ideal medicine or the ideal nutrition may not be exactly the same for everyone. We know that drugs can perform quite differently among different people. A drug might be very good for 30% of people and totally fail for the other 70%. So that's one reason. And the other reason has to do with the method itself. So what some people think gold standard science is, it's what's known as the double-blind randomized clinical trial. And I suspect you've probably talked about this in this show. The idea that you need to do a kind of test where you have two groups of people. One group gets the intervention and the other doesn't, and it's randomized and it's double-blind. So the people doing the study don't know who's getting the real drug versus the placebo, and the people in the study don't know either. Well, you cannot do that for nutrition because people know what they eat, right? And even if I blindfolded you, you would know if you were eating chocolate or oatmeal. So the whole concept of a blinded study just doesn't work for nutrition, and it doesn't work for a lot of other things too. So you can't stick to that idea. You have to be more flexible and you have to be more creative. And scientists are flexible and creative, and scientists have come up with lots of good ways to study things like nutrition and other health matters. Right. There's lots of excellent science, but it's not necessarily, quote, gold standard science.
Right. And even with, controlling confounding issues, humans are the most, how many confounders happen to humans where if you take a bunch of mice and you can control all that, you're sort of getting that information in a much cleaner way, but then you're applying it to humans in a way that makes sense. So yes, there's no, direct perfection to this process in that area. But I guess the question is, when you're talking about this thing that we've learned for so long, the scientific method, we're embedded in that in our science classes, it seems like innately we're working against the tide, because once something becomes established, I mean, when I think of things like, H. pylori infection, right? No one believed that H. pylori could exist, that could be a cause of ulcers. And the actual physicians that came up with it, which I'm blanking on their names, actually infected themselves to prove that it worked, that this existed. And it was a real uphill climb, like so many other scientific breakthroughs, so to speak. And so if it's innately kind of against you in terms of making changes, how does that play into the amount of doubt that goes into changing the system and changing the population in terms of that information?
Well, I wouldn't say science is against you. I'd say actually the opposite. It's sort of for us, because what it means is that science is intrinsically conservative, that the burden of proof in science is on the person with a new idea. And sometimes that can be frustrating, particularly for the people who have those new ideas. And my first book was all about an example of that. But what it does mean is that if scientists do change their mind, if they do say, oh yes, in fact, we've learned that bacterial infection causes ulcers, there's a good chance that that breakthrough, that new idea, is probably right, because scientists are not going to accept it unless there's a lot of evidence. And that really brings us to the thing I've argued the most about, is that what we really want to be asking when we ask about science is not, did they use a randomized double-blinded trial, But what is the evidence? What is the body of evidence? How broad is it? How diverse is it? Diversity in science is a really important strength. And I don't mean diversity in the sense of are the scientists black or white? I mean the types of studies. Have people looked at the problem from a number of different angles? And if there's a large body of diverse evidence that scientists say, yes, this, we used to think it was that ulcers were caused by stress, but now we have this very strong evidence that it's mostly bacterial, although stress may still play a role, but it's mostly caused by bacteria. If scientists say, yes, we have this big body of evidence, and if they've been working on it for a while, and this is something I think super important for ordinary folks to think about. We often read things in the press, new scientific study shows X, or new breakthrough shows Y. And the press, of course, are very influenced by that, because if it's not new, it isn't news, right? And so we have to understand that the press are going to be they're often going to be rushing to judge or rushing to get excited about something that seems really new. But as citizens, consumers, mothers, educators, we have to ask the question, okay, well, what is the evidence? Is this based on just one study, or do we now have a large body of work? And one thing I always tell my friends, family, students is never, ever, ever believe anything that's just based on one study. If someone's come up with a new study that shows something that seems surprising, startling, important, the next question is, okay, what are the other studies? And if the answer is there aren't any, then that's when we need to wait and reserve judgment until there's more information.
Yeah, and that kind of plays into this idea of consensus. And when you have sort of this overwhelming amount of information that's perhaps even reproducible, whether it's models, whether it's actual experiments, then you start to build on the body of evidence and then the consensus. And then at which point, and what are the forces against consensus that allow that information becomes kind of the gold standard or go into guidelines or any number of things that we actually use in real practical decision making. That's kind of an interesting area, especially right now. So bringing me to my question about your beautiful book, Merchants of Doubt. So maybe that's a segue, I don't know, but you tell me in terms of this idea of consensus, how does that play into, the solidifying an idea and moving with it, or what are the confounders that break against this concept that seems reasonable, right?
Yeah. So consensus is a really important concept in science. And again, it's something that we weren't generally taught in school, because often we were taught an image of science focusing on the heroic genius, the individuals like Einstein or Newton or Darwin. And of course, those people are important in the history of science. And I would never want to disrespect Isaac Newton or Charles Darwin, but that's not really what science is based on. An individual like Darwin might have a really important breakthrough idea, but it doesn't become science until it's been evaluated by all of the relevant experts in the field, until people have looked at the idea in different ways. And if we think about evolution, half a century went by from the time that Darwin first published The Origin of Species to when the idea of evolution by natural selection was widely accepted. So most people don't know that, but usually there's this very long and thorough process. And again, this is a good thing. Scientists are careful, they're conservative, they take their time, they check and they double check, they cross the T's and dot the I's. And this is why science typically, in most cases, not all, but in most cases, is reliable, because they go through this really, really tough process. Right. And at the end of that, what you get is consensus. That is to say, you get a broad agreement among the experts who have studied the problem. And so if we as individuals want to know, well, what should I believe about this or that thing? What we really should be asking ourselves is, what is the consensus of experts? Or is there a consensus? Because again, often the media will trot out some individual and say, this is a structural problem of media, right? You can have me on the show. You can't have 100 people at once, right? But this is the question we need to be asking ourselves. And this is the important role that groups like the CDC, the NIH, the National Academy of Sciences need to play for us. And they do play that role, but I think they could do a better job communicating to explain to the American people or the world at large, yes, we have a consensus, and here's how we got there. Or, no, we don't, and we're still working on it. And one of the things I've written about, you mentioned my book, Merchants of Doubt, one of the things I've written about is So if we're in a landscape or an environment where, someone's saying X, but someone else is saying Y, one of the things that the merchants of Tao do, and by that I mean people who don't want us to accept the science because they've got a vested economic or political or social interest, they will trot out some person, some dissenter, and they'll say, well, look, I want to introduce you to Joe, and Joe doesn't believe in climate change, or Joe doesn't believe vaccines are safe, or whatever the issue is, and make it seem as if it's a very contested issue. But in reality, in many of these cases, the scientific evidence is very robust, and there is, in fact, a scientific consensus, a hard-won consensus. Right. And so in our book, what we tried to emphasize was, look, here's the evidence of the consensus around the ozone hole, acid rain, DDT, a whole bunch of issues, and then look how these people tried to confuse us, to create doubt, to sell us doubt, by just trotting out some individual, in most cases, who wasn't even a scientist at all, or in some cases maybe was a scientist, but often not in the relevant field for the topic at hand.
Yeah, it was interesting, reviewing Merchants of Doubt, which really was just, it was a bestseller. It was such an important, that was in 2010, yes. I believe.
Yes, 2010.
And so even for years later, you could see just the groundswell around that. And it really brought to mind from the work in environmental health, about the tobacco industry influencing flame retarding chemicals that landed in couches. And it was like, look over there. It's really about the couch materials. It's not about the tobacco industry, or, it was just sort of a distraction, as was brought out by the Chicago Tribune did a Pulitzer Prize series on this. But it turns out tobacco was really behind that. But you're saying that those same influences came into play when it came to this concept of climate change, because you were talking about, what I found interesting researching your work is that you really were talking about at that time some very bright people who were having a very hard time embracing the science, even though they were super bright people. And you were trying to understand why these bright people, what were the influences of why they weren't embracing the concept that we were experiencing climate change in terms of the study that were actually out there and the consensus that was being reached. Tell me a little bit about what you discovered. It's almost like sociology to me. Like, what did you discover about how humans think and what influenced that?
Well, as you said, the story really begins with the tobacco industry. And we all know now that tobacco is an extremely dangerous product. It causes not just lung cancer, but probably 300 different terrible diseases. And we also know that the tobacco industry worked systematically for decades to try to confuse us about it, to try to persuade us that there wasn't a scientific consensus, we really didn't know, and therefore keep people smoking, and also to deny that smoking was addictive, even when we know that they knew that it was. So what we discovered, and I think it was kind of the shocking thing that made us realize we had to write a book, and we had to write a book that wasn't just aimed at other academics, was that the people who were denying the reality of climate change, this was taking place around the early to mid 2000s when we made this discovery. The people who were denying climate change were the same people who had denied the harms of tobacco. They had worked directly with Philip Morris or the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, and they had used the same strategies and tactics to cast doubt on the science of tobacco as they were now using to cast doubt on the science of climate change.
Yeah, and it was, what's it rooted in? It's rooted in the sense that people were going to have something broader, bigger, like their freedom. Connect that to the freedom, conversation with science. I think it's an important conversation in regards to that climate change, and also the new book that you wrote as well. Give me that concept and whittle it down for us.
Well, so as you said, the key people we were studying this story were highly intelligent, very educated people. In fact, they were scientists, but they weren't climate scientists. They were physicists, and they were quite prominent scientists. So it became clear very quickly they weren't dumb, right? It wasn't that they were stupid or ignorant or uneducated. And so at the time, most people were assuming that anyone who rejected climate science just didn't understand the science. And it was clear to us that that wasn't true. So the question was, why would they do this? And the sad truth is that the answer is political. And so this is where this whole terrain gets really tricky very quickly, because obviously, we want to respect the political opinions of a wide range of people. And we want everyone to read our books, irrespective of what their politics are. But what we discovered was that these people were really motivated by political ideology. And when I say that, I don't mean necessarily Democratic versus Republican, but a certain kind of ideology that was and has been linked to conservative politics in this country about the role of government. And the argument they made was that they were afraid that if tobacco was regulated, that it would lead to an expansion of government power and that we would lose our freedom. And then they applied the same argument to climate change, that if fossil fuels are regulated, if greenhouse gas pollution, if carbon pollution was regulated, this would lead to an expansion of the federal government and we'd lose our freedom. And the point we made in the book was to say, look, that concern is not necessarily wrong. I mean, I think nobody really wants, or very few people necessarily want bigger government. We want effective government. We want the government to protect us from corporations who are selling deadly products. And we all care about freedom. And this is partly why the argument was so powerful and persuasive, right? Because we all believe in freedom. But our argument was, but you don't protect freedom by lying about the science, right? Or you don't protect freedom by confusing people or making people feel like they have no idea what's going on. The correct response, in our opinion, is give people good information and trust people to make good choices with good information. So fundamentally, these folks distrusted us, distrusted the American people, thought we couldn't be trusted to make good choices if we actually understood the science. So instead, they challenged the science, and they claimed that the science wasn't reliable, that we didn't really know, even though they knew that that wasn't true. And we know they knew because we have their letters and diaries and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, and we've seen this in a couple other arenas, I would say, like gun control. You could kind of almost argue some of that arguments around freedom versus the science and statistics. And I guess you could certainly say that as we're moving now into a whole bunch of other topics. It's almost like, it feels almost as like it's like a baby in the bathwater mentality, that once you start picking and choosing where the freedom should and shouldn't remain, that you're also lumping into other very critical, important topics that could have ramifications for health. And so it's unsettling, obviously. The other thing I was going to say from our conversation here is that this concept of latency, where, the idea that, as we've seen, like with exposures to 9/11 or anything that happens years ago, and then it can come back later in life, this idea that the science and the consensus of folks leading to real world guidelines is so long that it's frustrating in some ways, right? Because in many ways, we have real life problems now, like health and wellness. A lot of things I mention is, you have to believe something in order to do something in order to protect your health now, as opposed to sort of gathering like the endocrine disrupting chemical world, which 25 years in the making, we really have good science and consensus, but there's other things that we want to move faster on, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I think, part of the challenge is a legitimate mismatch between the pace at which scientific knowledge develops and the pace at which the news media works, the pace at which we need to make decisions in our own life. And so you're absolutely right. Many of the diseases that are caused by toxic chemicals, endocrine disrupting chemicals, they may take 10, 20, 30 years to show themselves. And so that does make it hard for us sometimes to know what to think about these issues. But in addition, the manufacturers of these toxic chemicals exploit that. And they'll say, oh, but you can't prove this is harmful. You have to wait 40 years. And of course, if it's your health and your child or your life, you don't want to wait until it's too late. And so this is the argument that many scientists have made, and not just about chemicals, but also about climate change, that if you wait to be absolutely positively sure, it will be too late to protect people. And so you have to make decisions based on the best available information that we have right now. And that means there will always be some degree of uncertainty. I once wrote a paper called Living with Uncertainty, Learning from Mistakes. And my argument about this is that, again, the industry exploits uncertainty. They try to make us think that if we don't know the answer to every possible question, that we know nothing, and therefore we can't act. But in reality, we make decisions all the time in the face of uncertainty. I mean, every day you wake up and you go to work and you didn't know if this podcast would work out, but you were doing it, right? I show up in class every day. I show up.
Yeah.
I assume my students will be there. I don't know for a fact that they will. We save money for college. We save money for retirement. If we are taking care of our health, we, try to get appropriate, tests. I get my regular colonoscopy, even though it's no fun. No one wants to talk about it. But I mean, so.
Although the propofol ain't so bad.
Yeah.
That's a good night.
Oh,
That's
no,
a good
one
sleep.
time I had it burn like crazy. But anyway, right.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, the point is, in ordinary daily life, we don't let uncertainty paralyze us. We say, sure, yeah. I mean, my daughter just got married. Marriage is the ultimate leap of faith, right? Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't know it's going to work out. They certainly hope it will. We hope it will. We intend to do everything we can to support them. But in a way, many of the most important things in life are things where we do make decisions despite uncertainty. And so it's the same with our health and safety. But we want to make it based on the best information that we have available.
I mean, you're really describing to some degree the precautionary principle as well, right? So that you don't have to have all the hard and fast cause and effect, this causes that, this does that, but you really can use what's available, the science that has accumulated, the consensus, the general, thinking about, thinking before you leap, obviously. I guess this is I was going to say this at the end, but I was going to say this kind of plays into this latency concept. Do you think AI is going to speed this process up? And how do you feel? I find it fascinating. I'm using ChatGPT with my patients. I'm prompting it. I'm learning and teaching myself how to prompt it so it serves us both better. I was scared of it for a year, and then now I'm sort of dipping my toe in to see whether it's real, whether it's right. Certainly needs work, but I was just going to say, what do you think about that in terms of this concept of consensus and latency and the time factor?
Yeah, I think ChatGPT and AI in general are going to help us. And it's just not to say that these systems are perfect. And obviously, many people have legitimate concerns about it. But one of the things that I've already been using AI for is to summarize giant volumes of information. Because one of the things that's really hard for us as ordinary people is, or even as an educator, even as a professor, there's so much information out there that it's really hard sometimes to figure out what the consensus actually is. And there's no question that AI is going to make that job much easier going forward. And I've already used it also to do this. Let's say we want to understand the trajectory of scientific knowledge, because I and other historians of science have talked about this a lot. If science is a learning process, and if it changes over time, then one of the things we want to look for is to ask the question, has the knowledge stabilized? So could you see a period of time when, yes, people are really arguing, the studies are going back and forth, but then you see it stabilizes and people pretty much say, okay, this picture isn't really changing even when we get new information. That's really important in my opinion. And we can use AI to look at that, to see how the conversation is changing over time, and even to say, so when did scientists figure out that, this thing X was true? And it's really interesting to me. I've just did this just a few months ago with one of my postdocs on a particular issue. And I did this work by hand back in 2003. I asked the question, when did scientists have a consensus on climate change? And the answer I found was in the early to mid 1990s. I did that work with a pile of papers sitting at my desk. In fact, in the film version of Merchants of Doubt, we recreated that where I'm like up late at night and it's dark outside the window. So it's not that you couldn't do this work before, but that took me many, many weeks, several months to do back in 2004 when I did that work. Today, I can do it in a day. So it's going to make it much, much easier for us to grapple with large quantities of information and figure out, what the kind of bulk of the information says. Now, that said, there is one important caveat we have to make. AI is basically, the large language models are just essentially, chewing up and spitting out what's on the internet, and particularly what's on Wikipedia. If the internet is saturated with bad information, then we will get bad results from it. Right. And so in some important contested areas like climate change, you may get really bad results. So you have to be mindful of this question, what information is being summarized. And so for my students, there's a big issue in teaching now, should we or should we not let students use AI? And I think it would be really silly to say, no, they can't use it because, we know they will. And it is a powerful tool. We should be teaching people to use it intelligently.
Right.
So I gave this example in class. I asked ChatGPT, are Lucky Charms part of a healthy diet? And ChatGPT said, yes, Lucky Charms can be part of a healthy diet. So I think, yeah.
I would have said that when I was 5. I would have said, of course you're right.
Exactly. So QED, if there's junk out there, if the internet is saturated with false advertising, misleading marketing, ChatGPT is going to give that back to us. So we have to be mindful about those kinds of issues. But there's ways around that too. You can say, well, who says that it's part of a healthy diet, right? And if we find out it's the manufacturer, then we can ask, and what does Ailey Cohen say about it? What does David Katz say about it? What does the CDC say? And then we can, and then the other thing also, since you mentioned the precautionary principle, what do the Europeans say? Because we have seen some significant splits in recent years on the safety evaluations. The pesticide glyphosate is a case in point, where the European regulators have concluded that glyphosate probably is carcinogenic. The Americans have concluded that it's probably not. We can use AI to try to figure out why that difference is arising, and then we can decide who do we trust more.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it really argues upstream to the fact that we really need to keep our research going. If nothing more, we're pulling from a pot of information that has to be filled. It has to be filled in a way that makes sense to all of us. And so therein lies the circle, right? Are we going to fund the research that makes health decisions for us if we get cancer or which chemo? We need the science to infiltrate, our guidelines.
Well, exactly. And we don't have, we wouldn't have chemo at all. We wouldn't have any of these medicines and drugs were not for modern science. And so this is why, exactly as you say, that supporting research as an ongoing project is so important for all of us.
Right. Yeah. And it also gets me into this other question, which I'm sure people listening might have wanted to ask themselves is, now that we're talking about a little bit about medicine and health and, kind of big corporations and sometimes muddling of the science, of course, how do we feel about pharmaceutical industries, the fact that they really have helped create, they fund some of the best research for sure. They also can cherry pick what they want to share to the physicians that create the guidelines. So there's definitely, I use all the medications that are out there for my rheumatology patients, but I also use a lot of the integrative approaches that we have excellent science for. That's integrative medicine. So I guess the question is, we want to embrace the drugs when we need them for sure. And we want that good science. But can we trust pharmaceutical industries? And how is that, what's that conversation that you have with people who ask that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, it leads to the broader framework that we always need to be asking the question, okay, what interest does this serve? Who's benefiting from these claims or not? And so when it comes to big pharma, I think we do need to be mindful that obviously these are for-profit corporations. It's in their interest to be selling us all kinds of drugs, vaccines, devices, some of which may work better than others. But this is why we need two things. It's why we need peer-reviewed science, because we know that pharma has a vested interest in promoting these products. And so the whole point of having peer-reviewed science is that you have independent researchers, independent reviewers who are not on the payroll of the company, reviewing the work and checking it for its accuracy and validity. And so that's why protecting peer-reviewed science, protecting independent academic research is so critical, because without that, we would be at the mercy of big pharma that may or may not have our best interests at stake. And this is why, there's been recent attacks on scientific journals. And to me, this is just, unfathomable, right? Because we rely on the scientific journals as the independent arbiters of the evidence. And the other thing is regulation. This is why we need government regulation. And we know what happened when we didn't have government regulation, that a lot of toxic snake oil medicines were sold and people died from, patent medicines that were filled with mercury and lead and other terrible things. So the government plays a crucial role here in checking the claims of big pharma, in demanding that they do independent tests, in demanding that there's review of the data. And so our regulatory structures, though, have been under a lot of pressure in recent years. And it's not a coincidence that many of the big corporations, particularly the pesticide and chemical companies, have attacked government regulation. I mean, this is what our new work is all about, the big myth. There's a long history in this country of government regulation being a check on inappropriate corporate practices in a wide range of areas. But there's an equally long history of corporations fighting back against government regulation because they don't want anyone checking what they're doing. They would like to be able to sell toxic products or exploit workers or dump pollution in the river behind the factory. And so you need both. You need the private sector to innovate and to produce products, but you need government to check that the claims are legitimate and that they're selling products that are safe and not hazardous.
And in fact, in Europe, one of the big arguments about the food industry, coming from some of the best researchers, Dr. Maffini, but some of the greatest, food scientists I know out there, they talk about how in Europe, you have this separation of regulation and the scientists, whereas in the U.S., there's much more of a kind of an inbreeding, and they're not separated.
Right.
And I think that gives us the idea that and possibly the truth that many of the chemicals in Europe are actually better regulated than they are in the U.S. For a variety of reasons.
Yeah,
and different. Yeah.
Yeah, and the independence of the regulators is really so crucial, right? And that's why it's so upsetting when you have politicians putting pressure on the regulators, because we really count on the regulators to be independent and to be objective about the information. And if I could just say one other thing, too, because you mentioned integrative medicine, which I've always been interested in as well, because, we have a lot of empirical evidence that some of the traditional healing of earlier centuries worked. We have a lot of evidence that Chinese medicine is effective in some cases. We have evidence that acupuncture can work. But mainstream medicine has been, as you know better than I do, kind of resistant to looking closely at these things. And one thing I recall, some years ago, the NIH set up a Center for Research on Integrative Medicine, and the budget was very small. It was tiny compared to many of the other areas. But even so, many mainstream doctors criticized it. And they criticized it as a waste of money, throwing money away on voodoo and witchcraft. So I do think that mainstream medicine, needs to kind of wake up and smell the 21st century, right? And that we should be doing good research. And this gets back to what we said about the double-blind clinical trials also, right? I mean, you can't do a double-blind clinical trial on acupuncture. Well, some people have tried, but it's not persuasive. Right. So you need to be open to different methodological approaches in order to really test how effective these other modalities can be.
And to your point, when you think about consensus and time, I think acupuncture is a 5,000-year-old healing practice, and traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine and massage and human touch and work with spirituality and mind-body medicine. I mean, these are things that have been around independent of the last 200 years of, Procter & Gamble and J&J. The question really is, how can we use the best of all of these tools to help us be healthy? And integrative
and I think the answer is pretty
that
simple.
Concept.
Yeah, right. And not to be dogmatic. I mean, so I've spent a lot of time studying science, and I've written a lot of things defending science. I spent a lot of time defending climate scientists against attacks that I think are completely inappropriate. But it is also true that scientists can be dogmatic. They can be arrogant. They think that they know better than everybody else, and that's not helpful, right? So, I mean, I think, I one time wrote something where I said that if the history of science has one lesson, it's humility, right? That we should be humble about the fact that, yes, we've learned a lot of things and we've done a lot of good in the world, and many people live longer, better lives through modern medicine, but there's also a lot that we still really don't know about the human body, and especially about the mind-body relationship. And so, I mean, I've been practicing yoga for 40 years, being respectful of the idea that there's a lot we don't know, but there are these other traditions that try to get at it in a different way. And, I can just speak for myself personally that I suffer autoimmune disease. And I treat my diseases with levels of medication that most of my doctors are amazed are effective, like way lower than what most doctors would think that you need. And I attribute that to the fact that I also do yoga.
Yeah, and I think that is really quite important because that's kind of the mantra of my training and Dr. Andrew Weil and all of that work. But I test it out all the time. I mean, I have active patients over a long period of time who, when you're testing it in my microcosm of an experiment, so to speak, patients are experimenting with what works for them at the, obviously not getting in trouble or getting hurt. My job is to keep them from getting hurt. But the idea is that we're all sort of an experiment of one, an N of one for so much of what's available. The question is, should we be limiting what's available or opening that up and keeping it reasonable? How would that play into this recent conversation about acetaminophen and, where it plays into, the way I see it is, number one, I think acetaminophen, is one of the safest medications for pregnant women. Okay.
Yes.
And there's not many options. And there are lots of things we can do for pain control. I talk about them a lot. Journaling and massage and, just a variety of of options. But that being said, from a medicinal perspective, it's a very safe drug. There are some, thoughts of it being an endocrine disrupting chemical that can, but then there are lots of endocrine disrupting chemical exposures, right? That we don't even pay attention to, from nonstick pans to BPA, to plastic containers to personal care products. So in the perspective, I was taught always the least amount of medication over the shortest period of time to do the job you're looking for alternatives if they exist, and looking for outcomes and measuring the criteria for success and weighing all of that in what we choose to do from a medicinal perspective. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, you're the doctor, but I'm the scientist, and I think that's exactly right. I think just from any basic scientific standpoint, it's logical that you should always use the lowest dose of any drug that will be effective. I think that's pretty much common sense. And I think we also know, as you said yourself, that, there are other ways to address pain. So if you can, in addition to pharmaceuticals, you can also do yoga or massage or other things that can be helpful, then of course we should be encouraging that. And I do think mainstream medicine has not done enough to remind patients or to support patients in those modalities. And then we get into insurance too, because, my husband many years ago blew a disc in his back, and insurance was completely ready to pay for surgery which was going to cost $15,000, or he could do physical therapy, which was going to cost like a tenth that amount, and the insurance wouldn't cover it, or would only cover a very small amount of it. And I thought, well, okay, so that's just a screwed up insurance system, right? In the end, he went for the physical therapy and it worked, and he was fine without surgery. So we definitely need doctors and insurance companies to be more on board about integrating modalities. But I think the main thing that is, we need to be thinking about here with this Tylenol thing is that it is absolutely shameless that some politicians are exploiting the suffering of autistic people and their families, because autism is a really challenging situation for many parents. Many parents of autistic children are very frustrated because they feel that mainstream medicine doesn't have much to offer them. And so they're vulnerable to exploitation by someone who comes along and says, oh, your vaccine caused it, or Tylenol caused it. And I think that's really shameless. And I think the people who are doing that should hang their heads in shame. And, I think what you're saying here is so important for people to realize sometimes Tylenol may be the right choice, and certainly high fevers during pregnancy are risky, right? So it could be that the risk of taking Tylenol is way less than the risk of, but all drugs carry some risk, right? And that's important for people to understand as well. And so you should be careful. And, I have 2 children, and I was thinking, of course, any pregnant woman should be careful about taking any drug during pregnancy. Right. But then again, you should also be careful, like you said, maybe don't use nonstick pans. Maybe don't eat too much peanut butter, right? There's a lot of hazards out there. And again, the tobacco industry exploited that. The tobacco industry used to talk about the menace of daily life as if somehow it was okay to smoke because there were a lot of other hazards too. And that's, of course, just silly.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, and I said the Tylenol thing, and what I should have actually said was this recent, headlines about Tylenol contributing to autism, and they actually it was causing autism, I think was the headline, which we know in science there's very little, at least in human studies, that there's a cause. The difference between a cause and association is incredibly important. And we should be thinking about that because there's in human studies, this direct cause is really hard to find, right? We haven't even, there's very limited evidence that anything is a cause and effect one-to-one, except for maybe radiation causing skin cancer and lung cancer, from tobacco. But beyond that, you have to control for these environments like in mice and the studies have really shown that Tylenol is in fact one of the safest that can be extrapolated from animal studies for sure. Otherwise, it's all correlation.
Right. But then this is another good example. I mean, sometimes we do know the mechanisms, like you said. I mean, we know something now about how the chemicals in tobacco can cause mutations that cause cancer. And I think the scientific community could do a much better job of explaining that, because you hear people throw around all the time, correlation is not causation. But what do they mean by that? Like, because actually sometimes correlation is causation and sometimes it's not. And the question is, do you know what the mechanism is? And the other thing I think scientists and doctors could do a much better job at is that often scientists and doctors just don't explain how we know something. And I think we've all had the experience of having some doctor or hearing some scientist assert X. And then you're left thinking, or at least I'm left thinking, well, how do they know that? And so I once did an experiment. I was giving a talk to an audience of scientists and doctors, and I asked the audience, how many of you here think that vaccines cause autism? No one thought that. And then I said, okay, how many of you can tell me how we know that vaccines don't cause autism? And out of an audience of about 50 people, there were only about 3 people who actually could answer that question.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, guys, maybe you need to do a little more homework here, because if I were the mother of an autistic child, I would want my doctor to be able to explain to me, well, how do we know that this is the case? Otherwise, I just feel like he's saying, trust me, I'm the expert,
Yeah, I mean, and to that point about trusting the messenger, it's like we often rely on the messenger, either they're charismatic or they, there's something maybe otherwise that maybe you are identifying with to listen to that person, maybe less so the science that's actually behind the statement, all of which needs to be explored. But, listen, I grapple myself with a lot of what's going on right now. Yeah. I mean, it's a really hard time, I think. And, sometimes you start to doubt your own thoughts. And again, I jump back into the science of what I know and how to trust those resources. And I look up PubMed studies and I look at the people who are speaking to certain topics. But not everyone can do that, right? Because I don't know my IT guy coming in telling me my computer's a mess. I'm trusting the messenger. I like the guy that does my computer stuff. I haven't studied for that. So how do you rationalize even trusting the messenger when you're not a lifelong scientist?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think part of the answer has to do with, who's got the training and the expertise. And in my book, Why Trust Science, I talk about this at some great length, right? So if your, wiring goes off, you're going to call an electrician, right? Because you know that an electrician has the training and the expertise to fix it. And you're not going to call your dentist to fix your wiring and vice versa, right? And that's a kind of common sense understanding that we all have. And yet, when it comes to science, somehow that common sense breaks down. And so some actress or some influencer or some politician will get on the airwaves blathering about science, often saying things that are false, that we know are wrong. And yet people are influenced by it because they don't apply that same common sense argument. And so my common sense argument is that if you're interested in science, you have to ask scientists and you have to look for scientific information. And that means that if you Google something, you can't just trust the first hit or even the first 5 hits that come up, because often people are gaming the system. You have to go to the CDC or the NIH, or maybe someone like yourself who, people know you have a medical degree and they've just heard you explain something about what your process is, or someone like me who I've now written 10 books. And, you can see my books are big books because they're filled with footnotes. And we we work really hard to make sure people could follow back to the original sources if they want to. So it's really about training and expertise. And on some level, it is about trusting experts, which is, a little scary and not necessarily perfect. It would be, in a perfect world, we would want to be able to check everything for ourselves, but that's just not realistic or practical, even for anyone.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, because we don't have that background and we don't necessarily have the time and effort and wherewithal and ability to study all of these topics and so in depth. So we are relying a little bit on who is the messenger, what is their background, what got them to this point, how many degrees do they have at the end of their name? I mean, this is what we have to work with in many ways, not always, of course. I wanted to mention something, is it possible that we can get it wrong in science that, for instance, I use this example, with COVID-19, there was this real pushback against long COVID at the beginning. I, as a rheumatologist, I was seeing tons of people who were experiencing what I would now be identified and called long haul COVID, right? That was a new finding in the midst of all of this, our historical robustness of science, right? And immunology. And then there are also the concept of vaccines. It's a very hot topic for sure. And shouldn't we have a lot of people in the room that have a lot of expertise in this area to at least have a conversation? And we've had vaccines that have had problems and had to be revamped and remarketed or rejiggered and put out there or taken off the market. So it's not a perfect system. What do you say to that in terms of, can science be flawed, or is it so hard and fast that we aren't flexible?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that science can be flawed, and scientists sometimes do get things wrong. And again, in my book, Why Trust Science, I actually looked at a set of examples where scientists and doctors did get things wrong. And I think, if people who are listening want to buy one book, I hope they'll buy that one, because I do think that these examples are really important for us to think through. Right. And in some of them, when we look back historically, what we find is actually the scientists didn't get it wrong. The scientists had it right, but politicians got it wrong. So that gets back to what we've already been discussing, is we have to go back to the science. We can't just trust what politicians are saying. But the other thing that I think happened during COVID, I think there were a lot of mistakes made. And I think some of that had to do with what I just said before about humility. There was a lot of pressure on scientists to come up with answers quickly. And I have a lot of sympathy for those people. They were in a very, very difficult situation. People were dying. So to want to come up with an answer quickly and to say, here's what we need to do, I think that was a very human response, but I do think it was wrong. I think that the lesson that we should take from COVID is that when you don't know the answer, then the right thing to say is, I don't know. I don't know yet. We're working on it, and we will get back to you just as soon as possible. And I feel like that shouldn't be that hard. I mean, this happens to me all the time in class. Students ask a question, and I say, I don't know, I'll get back to you on Wednesday, right? That's like the most basic thing that you do in the classroom is to be honest when a student asks a question you don't know. And yet, during that COVID period, it's not what scientists did. And so I do think that in the early weeks and months when they were still figuring out what was this disease, how bad was it, how was it being spread, that CDC, World Health Organization, they were altogether too definitive, especially about masks, as you may recall. And they should have just said, we're working on it, we don't know, we'll get back to you just as soon as we can.
Would that have seeded a little bit more distrust, you think?
I think the opposite. I think that's the fear. I mean, we know that the World Health Organization was afraid to tell people to wear masks in those early days and weeks because they were afraid people would hoard masks. And that was a legitimate concern, right? And some people did hoard masks, but they lied. They said, masks don't work. And that wasn't true. They did not know that. And in fact, if you look at the history of respiratory illness, and already in the early days, people were pretty sure this was a respiratory illness, there was good reason to think that masks could slow the spread of the disease. But instead of being honest with people, they lied and they said, no, masks won't help. Now, I don't know what you think, but I think the quickest way to sow distrust is to lie, right? I mean, it's why I don't trust the tobacco industry. It's an industry we know lied. It's why I don't trust the fossil fuel industry. It's an industry we know lied. So I think that by not being forthright about the uncertainties, they actually created a situation that generated distrust. And then the other thing, of course, they did was to focus to too great a degree on the biological science and not the social sciences, because there was so much effort placed in that first year about getting vaccines, and the scientists who did that work were heroic and did something quite amazing, produced a quite safe and fairly effective vaccine very quickly, in under a year. It's really an astonishing accomplishment. But and now I mean not so much the scientists working on the vaccines, but the CDC and NIH paid very little attention to the social aspects of vaccination. And yet if they had asked any historian of science or historian of medicine anywhere in the world, we could have told them, you will get a lot of resistance to this vaccine. There will be a lot of people who don't want to take the vaccine, no matter how safe your science shows it is.
How would they have fixed that, though? In retrospect, how could they have handled that better?
Well, I think it gets back to what you said about trusted messengers. We know there's a lot of evidence that people make their decisions very much based on trusted messengers. So CDC could have thought about developing a program of trusted messengers. That could have involved nurses. It could have involved actors and influencers. It could have involved a lot of different kinds of people. But instead, they just rolled it out and assumed that everybody would show up and get vaccinated. And of course, that didn't happen. And a lot of people died in this country whose lives could have been saved had they been vaccinated.
Yeah. Yeah, so much. I could have you here all day, for real. I'd need some drinks, right? I don't know if you're a drinker, but I would certainly be drinking the rest of the conversation. But I kept you here too long. I want to ask a couple kind of tangibles and take-home frameworks that we might be able to offer people listening. If a non-expert listener wanted to, just a simple framework, a take-home framework for engaging with scientific claims, especially in controversial areas that we talked about a few here, what would you suggest? What are the red flags they might watch out for?
Yeah, well, I would say a big red flag is people who are talking about science who are not scientists and do not have scientific training. That's an obvious one. And if you just didn't listen to people who are talking about science but have no scientific training, probably 80% of the disinformation would be filtered out. Second thing to look for are people who are scientists but don't have expertise in the area they're talking about. So the folks we wrote about in Merchants of Doubt, they were mostly nuclear physicists, but they're claiming that tobacco is safe. That should have been a giant red flag, especially for the journalists who are interviewing them. I mean, this guy is a nuclear physicist. He helped build the atomic bomb. How does that make him an expert on cancer? The answer is it doesn't. And so if we just ignored those two groups, then you'd be getting rid of about 90% of the disinformation. And then the third thing obviously has to do with politics and politicians. If a politician is making a claim about science or scientists, ask yourself the question, well, what does he stand to gain? What does he stand to gain by either defending or attacking this particular science? And unfortunately, right now, it's mostly attacking, right? What are these scientists gaining by attacking scientists, by attacking academics, by attacking me, to make it personal, right? And once you look at it that way, then you quickly realize, and I guess one last important thing, we all have interests, right? We all have something that we're trying to achieve. Like, I'd like people to read my books, right? You probably want people to read your books too, or to be healthier or whatever it is. But I think one thing that a lot of people have trouble getting their heads around, we live in a society that is so focused on money and competition that I sometimes think we have trouble believing that there's anyone who isn't being driven by the money. And so I've had people say to me, climate scientists are just in it for the money. And then I just want to sit down with them and say, every single scientist I know, myself included, could have made a lot more money doing something else. I mean, when I was a junior geologist, the advice I got from everyone in the company I worked for was to get an MBA, that I would make far more money getting an MBA than going back and getting a PhD. So scientists, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, are not in it for the money. And this may be hard for people to believe, but most scientists I know went into science because they really wanted to learn. They really wanted to understand how the world worked. And they believe that if we understand how the world works, we can actually have better lives. And so it's a very uncynical thing to say in a moment when people are very, very cynical. So I would just encourage your listeners to drop the cynicism just for a few minutes to say, look, there are all these people out there who are really working hard, trying to make your life better. And to the extent that that's true, it means that we really do have good grounds to trust science in most cases, right? And if you want to know which cases not to, then I guess we need another hour.
Right, and more drinks.
And more drinks, right.
And more drinks, don't forget that. Are you hopeful for the future? I mean, I guess that is a very hopeful statement. I think it's very empowering. But it's a really kind of interesting little daunting time right now. And so the question is, do you see us coming out of this? Where do you see science playing a role with everything, including AI, changing how we perceive everything these days?
Well, I think there's that famous cliche that crisis is also an opportunity. I mean, I do think this is a very challenging time for American science. It's probably the most challenging time maybe ever in the history of American science. Yeah. But I'm hopeful that there will be some good to come out of it, which is it is forcing the scientific community to think harder about what it does and why it does what it does and what our relationship is to broader communities. Because, as a person who teaches in, one of the most elite, famously elite institutions on the planet, I think we haven't done enough to reach out to our communities and to explain to the American people what we do and why we do it. When I worked at the University of California, this issue would sometimes come up, and I would always say to my colleagues, I would say, who do we work for? We work for the people of California. Our salaries are paid for by the taxpayers of the state of California. And for me, just keeping that in mind was always super important. Now, when you work at a private institution, it's not quite the same. But in a way, it's almost the same, because if you ask the question, well, who pays for our research? Guess what? It's the American people. It's the taxpayer. I mean, most of my books were written with grants from the federal government. So I think all of us should be a little bit more mindful about that, and to think that part of our job should be to think about how we can give back more to the community, how we can share our knowledge, not just with fellow academics, but with broader communities. And that's why I'm here on your show today.
Yeah, and you're doing great. I love it. And, really, that's why I started this podcast. I wanted to speak with people who are not influencers necessarily, who are not already, part of the media movement, who do great research. I wanted to interview people that actually create the research that becomes the headlines instead of just the people talking about the headlines. So, it was really important to hear from everyone as much as I could in these areas. And scientists, they don't generally want to speak out, right? No. In fact, a lot of them like to sit I'm not a scientist, but I like to sit in a library and do my own work. A lot of people just aren't geared up for the media world. And so there must be I think, to your point, adding a piece of communication between science and the public has not really been, invested in.
Right. It hasn't been a priority. And I'm hoping that maybe part of what comes out, a good thing that could come out of the present situation, is a greater commitment to that broader communication.
For sure. Yeah, I think that's great. What are you working on now, and how can anyone reach you if they wanted to reach out to you? In a good way.
What are you doing now? The answer is my laundry.
Yeah.
Whenever I finish a big book, there's always a little time to regroup and think about what's next. So I have a few projects in mind, but I haven't decided yet. So, but people I'm easy to find. If you just Google Oreskes Harvard, you'll find my homepage. My books are available at all good booksellers, and I like to push bookshop.org, which supports your local.
Your most recent book, yeah, wonderful.
Support your local bookstore. The Big Myth, which is really about this issue of regulation and how we figure out what the right balance is between individual freedom and government protection for people who need protection. So, and stay tuned.
And we'll put links as much as we can to ways, to your work, of course, to your TED Talk, which I thought was excellent.
Thank you.
Having two teenagers, I think it's important that I get them to sit down and sit still and maybe watch that.
Nice.
So, here's hoping. But yeah, it's just been a pleasure talking with you. It's been eye-opening. And, I want you to keep doing your thing because it's just so important.
Thank you.
And this conversation is important. So
great.
Thank you, Dr. Naomi Oreskes, for being here.
You're welcome.
It.
Thank you, Ailey.